The Wehrmacht celebrated after Kursk. A year later, Bagration annihilated 28 of their divisions. The summer of 1943 had been an inferno of steel and fire. On the wheat fields of Kursk, the Wehrmacht launched its last great offensive in the east, a desperate gamble to regain the initiative. They crashed against a wall of Soviet guns and tanks in the largest armored battle in history. The losses were terrifying on both sides, but in the end, it was the Germans who fell back, exhausted and decimated. However, Goebbels' propaganda machine was expert at transforming defeats into defensive victories. The official line was that the Soviet offensive had been contained, that the Red Army had been bled to the point of collapse. In the trenches of Army Group Center, in the Belarus sector, the soldiers listened to this news with a sigh of relief. They had survived Kursk. Perhaps the worst was over. The spring of 1944 brought a deceptive calm to this sector of the front. Belarus was a land of primeval forests, so dense that sunlight barely penetrated to the ground, and of vast swamps that stretched to the horizon. For the veterans of Army Group Center, this terrain was their greatest ally. They considered it impassable for any large-scale offensive. It was a natural fortress. A soldier named Günther, a Stalingrad veteran who had been evacuated with a wound before the encirclement, felt this complacency. His division had been reconstituted and sent to what the officers called a rest sector. His days consisted of routine patrols through silent forests, reinforcing wooden bunkers, and writing letters home. The war, the real war, seemed to be happening elsewhere. In Italy, where the Allies were inching forward, in Ukraine, to the south, where other army groups were bearing the main pressure of the Soviet steamroller. Morale was surprisingly stable. The men believed in their defenses. They believed in the strength of their lines, anchored in cities that had been turned into fortresses. And above all, they believed in the impenetrability of the Pripyat marshes, a swamp the size of a small nation that protected their southern flank. The generals in their headquarters looked at the maps and nodded. No tank army could move through that mire. This sense of security led to fatal decisions. The best panzer divisions, the army's armored elite, were withdrawn from Belarus and sent south to shore up the front in Ukraine. What remained was a static infantry force, with few mobile reserves. Stretched thin over a front that was far too wide, they were anchored in their positions, confident, awaiting a summer they believed would bring only limited fighting. But beneath the surface of this calm, the earth was trembling. In the deep forests beyond the German lines, Soviet partisans watched, counted, and reported. And on the other side of the front, in almost absolute silence, the Red Army was assembling the largest force the world had ever seen. Günther's men listened to the croaking of frogs in the swamps at night, unaware that soon that sound would be drowned out by the roar of thousands of engines and the thunder of 20,000 cannons. The quiet sector was about to become the epicenter of the greatest military disaster in German history. While Army Group Center slumbered in its false security, the most ambitious operation of the entire war was being designed in the halls of the Kremlin. The plan, conceived by the Stavka, the Soviet High Command, was breathtaking in its audacity. Its objective was not simply to push the Germans back, it was to encircle and utterly annihilate an entire army group, to wipe it off the map in a single, catastrophic campaign. The cornerstone of this plan was a concept in which the Soviets had become masters: maskirovka, deception. This was not a simple feint or a diversionary maneuver, but a continent-spanning symphony of disinformation, designed to convince the enemy to look south while the real dagger was being prepared for a stab in the center. To the south, in Ukraine, the Soviets put on a show for German reconnaissance planes and their spies. They created entire armies out of thin air. Wooden tanks and dummy cannons were arranged under camouflage nets. Immense volumes of fake radio traffic were generated, simulating the communications of large armored formations preparing to attack. The German High Command took the bait. Meanwhile, in absolute secrecy, the real concentration of forces was taking place in Belarus. More than 2,400,000 men, 6,000 tanks, and thousands of aircraft slipped towards the front under the cover of night and strict radio silence. To mobilize such a force without being detected was a monumental logistical feat. It was a ghost army, gathering for a final judgment. The terrain, the Germans' greatest asset, would become their undoing. Where the Germans saw impenetrable swamps, Soviet engineers saw a highway. Working in darkness, they built thousands of kilometers of corduroy roads, hidden bridges, and causeways through bogs that German maps marked as impassable. The mud that was supposed to stop the tanks would become the secret corridor for their advance. In command of this doomed army was Field Marshal Ernst Busch, a devout Nazi and an old-school general whose loyalty to Hitler was as unshakable as his lack of imagination. Busch was a man of static defenses, of fixed lines on a map. He was the jailer of his own troops, a general who believed that willpower and discipline could overcome any material disadvantage. At his headquarters, intelligence reports from his own spy master, Reinhard Gehlen, piled up on his desk. They warned of an unprecedented massing of Soviet troops opposite his sector. They spoke of new artillery divisions, of the arrival of Guards Tank Corps. Busch, along with the high command in Germany, dismissed them. They were exaggerations, propaganda, or at worst, the maskirovka they were expecting, a feint to distract from the main attack in Ukraine. The blindness of the German high command was total. They fell into the trap not in spite of their intelligence, but because of it. They were so convinced that the Soviets would attack on the open ground of the South that they interpreted all evidence to the contrary as confirmation of their own theory. They saw the shadow on the wall and mistook it for the beast, never realizing the real beast was silently standing behind them. This doctrinal rigidity was reinforced by Hitler's direct orders. The directive of the Feste Plätze, or fortress cities, forbade any tactical withdrawal. Cities like Vitebsk, Orsha, and Bobruisk were to be defended to the last man. In Busch's mind, these fortresses anchored his line. In the reality of the Soviet plan, they were not anchors. They were the millstones that would drag his entire army to the bottom of the abyss. The trap was set, and the German jailers had locked themselves inside with their prisoners. Deep within the Kremlin, where decisions could rewrite history or erase a man from existence, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and an almost physical tension. The general plan for Operation Bagration lay on the table. Joseph Stalin paced back and forth before the enormous map of Belarus, listening to his marshals, Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, the Stavka coordinators, nodded as the broad outline was approved. Then, Stalin's finger stopped. It rested on the southern sector of the offensive, the one assigned to the First Belarusian Front. Commanded by Konstantin Rokossovsky, Rokossovsky's plan was unique, daring, and, in Stalin's eyes, problematic. Instead of a single, massive armored fist to break the lines, Rokossovsky proposed splitting his force into two separate pincers, two powerful attacks that would advance through the treacherous swamps to converge and encircle the German Ninth Army at the city of Bobruisk. Stalin stopped pacing. The silence in the room grew heavy. "Why split the blow?" he asked in his low, guttural voice. "A single, powerful fist. We have always succeeded with a single, powerful fist." Stalin's logic was brutally simple, the overwhelming concentration of force at a single point. Rokossovsky stepped forward. He was a man of distinguished bearing, with a calmness that belied the nightmare he had lived through. He had survived Stalin's purges, years of imprisonment and torture in the Gulag where his ribs were broken and his teeth knocked out. He knew the man before him better than anyone in the room, and he knew that to contradict him was to gamble with his own life. In a steady voice, he laid out his reasoning. The terrain, Comrade Stalin, does not permit a single advance. The swamps would channel a single attack and turn it into a bottleneck. But two pincers, moving through ground the enemy considers impassable, will allow us to close the trap behind them before they can react. It is the only way to ensure a swift and total encirclement at Bobruisk. Stalin stared at him for a long moment, his yellow eyes piercing. Then, with a dismissive gesture, he said, "Go out and think it over." It was a blood-chilling order. In Stalin's lexicon, it was the final warning. Rokossovsky saluted, turned, and left the room. In the hallway, the silence was absolute. He could feel the gazes of the other generals, a mixture of pity and fear. He could have yielded. He could have gone back in and accepted the dictator's will, saving his career and his life. But Rokossovsky had designed the plan. He believed in it. He knew it was the only way to achieve the decisive victory they sought. After a few minutes that felt like an eternity, he re-entered the room. Stalin looked up from his pipe. "Well, Comrade Stalin, I have reconsidered. I insist on my plan." The atmosphere turned glacial. Stalin's anger was a palpable force. Go out again and think it over, I warn you. This is the last time. Again, the hallway. Again, the silence. This time, the threat was no longer veiled. It was a suspended death sentence. Rokossovsky faced a choice: his professional conviction or his survival. He walked back into the room, his face impassive. Comrade Stalin, the two-pincer plan remains the best solution. There was a dead silence. Zhukov and Vasilevsky held their breath. Then, the unthinkable happened. Stalin walked over to Rokossovsky, stared at him, and a strange smile played on his lips. He came closer and put a hand on his shoulder. A commander's confidence is a crucial element of success, he said. Go and carry out your plan. In that moment, the fate of Army Group Center was sealed, not by a strategic calculation on a map, but by an act of incredible moral courage from a man who dared to look a tyrant in the eye and stand for the truth. The decision was made. The annihilation could begin. The night of June 21st to the 22nd was strangely quiet at the front, but in the German rear, a silent storm was about to break. Thousands of Soviet partisans, coordinated by radio from Moscow, emerged from the forests. They placed more than 10,000 explosive charges on the railway lines. Just after midnight, detonations echoed across Belarus. Rails were twisted, bridges collapsed. In a single coordinated night, the logistical network of Army Group Center was completely paralyzed. It was the prelude. At dawn on June 22nd, exactly 3 years after the German invasion, the eastern sky caught fire. 20,000 cannons and mortars opened fire simultaneously. It was an artillery barrage of a density that made the bombardments of the First World War seem small. For 2 hours, an uninterrupted torrent of steel and fire fell upon the German trenches. The forward positions simply ceased to exist, vaporized along with their defenders. Then, through the smoke and scorched earth, the infantry advanced. Wave after wave of Red Army soldiers, screaming their battle cry, "Ura!" fell upon the dazed survivors. The German lines, once considered impregnable, shattered in a matter of hours. The German soldiers who didn't die in the initial bombardment found themselves fighting for their lives, often surrounded, with no communication to their headquarters. Immediately behind the infantry came the tanks. Tank and mechanized corps poured through the breaches, bypassing pockets of resistance and driving deep into the enemy's rear. They did not stop to fight. Their objective was to advance, to cut off retreat routes, to close the encirclements. The Soviet doctrine of deep battle, perfected over 3 years of brutal warfare, was being executed to perfection. In the north, the fortress city of Vitebsk was the first target. In just 3 days, the 3rd Belarusian Front completely surrounded the city, trapping 5 German divisions, some 35,000 men of the 3rd Panzer Army. Hitler's order to resist to the last man had turned them into prisoners in their own fortress. Further south, Rokossovsky's two-pincer plan unfolded with lethal precision. While one force drove directly for Bobruisk, the other, led by General Pavel Batov, moved an entire army through the swamps the Germans had deemed impassable. T-34s advanced over corduroy roads, water and mud lapping at their tracks. The Germans woke one morning to find Soviet tanks in their rear, where they believed they were protected by miles of marshland. On June 27th, Rokossovsky's pincers closed. 70,000 soldiers of the German 9th Army were trapped in a cauldron east of Bobruisk. What followed was a massacre. The Red Air Force, with total command of the sky, turned the pocket into a shooting gallery. Columns of German tanks, trucks, and soldiers attempting to flee west were mercilessly bombed and strafed. The ground was littered with burning vehicles and thousands of corpses. The decisive blow came on July 3rd. Soviet vanguards, having advanced over 250 kilometers in less than 2 weeks, liberated Minsk, the capital of Belarus, and in doing so, they closed the largest encirclement of the entire operation. What was left of the 4th Army and the survivors of the 9th, over 100,000 men, were trapped in a vast pocket east of the city. For the German soldiers inside these pockets, the situation was a hellish repeat of Stalingrad. They were surrounded, without supplies, without hope of rescue, and under constant attack. A young lieutenant named Friedrich, trapped in the Minsk encirclement, described in his diary the total breakdown of discipline. Units dissolved. Officers lost control. Groups of men tried to break out through the forests. only to be hunted down by partisans or annihilated by Soviet patrols. The mighty Army Group Center was not being defeated. It was being dismembered, piece by piece. The Soviet steamroller was unstoppable. On June 28th, with his armies disintegrating and encircled on all sides, Ernst Busch was still clinging to Hitler's order not to yield a single foot of ground. From his bunker, he frantically telephoned the Führer's headquarters, begging for permission for tactical withdrawals that might have saved some of his divisions. The requests were denied. Hitler, disconnected from reality, continued to demand fanatical resistance in positions that had already been overrun. Finally, the scale of the disaster became undeniable even to Hitler. Busch was summarily dismissed. In his place, Field Marshal Walter Model was appointed, a defensive specialist and the man they turned to when a front collapsed. Known as the Führer's fireman, Model arrived at the front with a reputation for being able to stabilize any crisis. But when he landed at what was left of Army Group Center's headquarters, he was met with a scene of absolute chaos. He asked where his armies were. A staff officer with a 1,000-yard stare simply pointed to an empty area on the map. "There are no armies left to command, Herr Field Marshal," he said. Model had been sent to put out a fire, but the house had already burned to the ground. The domino effect of the destruction of Army Group Center was immediate and catastrophic for the entire structure of the Eastern Front. A gap 1,000 kilometers wide had been torn open. It was not a crack. It was an abyss. The annihilation of nearly 40 divisions in the center completely exposed the southern flank of Army Group North, which now risked being cut off against the Baltic Sea. In the south, Army Group North Ukraine had to retreat hastily to avoid having its own flank exposed. The road to the heart of Europe was open. The Red Army was advancing at a speed not seen since the early days of Operation Barbarossa, but this time, it was they who were practicing blitzkrieg. The front line moved tens of kilometers a day. The capitals of the Baltic states, Poland, and East Prussia itself, the cradle of Prussian militarism, were now within reach of Soviet tanks. The Germans had no reserves to plug the hole. The elite panzer divisions were tied down in Normandy, fighting the Allied landing that had begun just 2 weeks earlier. Germany was being crushed between two fronts. Psychologically, the blow was devastating. The news of the Parade of Shame in Moscow on July 17th, where 57,600 German prisoners were marched through the streets, was a public humiliation that not even Goebbels could spin. The entire world saw the irrefutable proof of the catastrophe. For the German people, who had been fed stories of defensive victories, the image of their ragged, defeated soldiers parading through Red Square was a profound shock. On the front lines, the morale of the Wehrmacht plummeted. Soldiers began to speak of Zauberei, or witchcraft, to describe the way the Soviets appeared from nowhere, surrounding and annihilating them. The fear of encirclement became a collective psychosis. Faith in Hitler's leadership, already shaky after Stalingrad, eroded even further. 3 days after the march in Moscow, a group of German officers attempted to assassinate Hitler in the 20th July plot, an act of desperation born partly from the conviction that the war was irretrievably lost, a conviction forged in the fire of Operation Bagration. The collapse was not just military, it was total. By mid-August, after nearly 2 months of relentless advance, the Soviet steamroller finally began to lose momentum. It was not stopped by German resistance, but by its own monumental success. Supply lines were stretched over 700 kilometers, and the vanguard troops were exhausted. But the pause did not mean a respite for the Germans. It simply meant the cataclysm was over. The Soviet victory had not been partial. It had been total. When the dust settled and the accountants of death did their work, the figures revealed a catastrophe that surpassed even Stalingrad in terms of military destruction. Army Group Center, which a year earlier had considered itself secure in its Belarusian bastion, had lost nearly 400,000 men, counting killed, wounded, and captured. But the most devastating statistic was this. Of the 34 divisions that made up the Army Group at the start of the offensive, 28 had been either completely destroyed or had disintegrated to the point of no longer existing as combat formations. It was a loss of men and materiel from which the Wehrmacht, already fighting on 2 fronts, would never recover. In the long run, Operation Bagration was the death blow for the Third Reich. Launched just 16 days after the Allies landed in Normandy, it created the perfect storm that sealed Germany's fate. The Reich was now caught in a vice, crushed between the Anglo-American hammer in the west and the Soviet anvil in the east. The operation demonstrated to the world that the Red Army had achieved total mastery in the art of war. The doctrine of deep battle, with its massive encirclements and relentless exploitation, had been executed on a scale and with a sophistication that surpassed even the German blitzkrieg of the early years. They had learned from their enemy, improved upon his methods, and were now using them to dismember him. If Kursk was the moment the Wehrmacht's sword was broken, Bagration was the moment its spine was snapped in two. The destruction of Army Group Center not only opened a direct route to Warsaw and the borders of the Reich itself, it eliminated the last great concentration of veteran infantry Germany possessed. After Bagration, Germany's defeat was no longer a possibility or a probability. It had become a mathematical certainty, a simple matter of time. The German celebration after Kursk had become the hollow echo of an army that no longer existed.